Good morning. The hearing will come to order. I want to thank our witnesses for being here with us today. Today's hearing comes at an important moment. Our nation's communication networks are facing rapidly evolving threats, ranging from fraud and espionage to sabotage. In a few minutes, we will examine and consider how government and industry can work together to strengthen our network security. The United States intelligence community assesses that the People's Republic of China is the most active and persistent cyber threat to United States institutions. Last year, the hacking group Salt Typhoon, backed by the PRC, infiltrated US telecom providers. We need a unified cyber defense strategy now more than ever. Threat actors are deploying advanced technology at scale to try to undermine our networks at every juncture. These attacks are increasingly supercharged by artificial intelligence as well. While private industry continues to innovate, collaborate, and defend against these threats, the risk environment is growing more complex. Congress must coordinate with industry and ensure robust federal response. Supply chain security remains a critical part of this conversation. The PRC-linked companies such as Huawei continue to pose significant risks to allied communication infrastructure. Congress created the RIP and Replace program to remove this vulnerable equipment from portions of American networks, and the FCC continues to identify high-risk vendors. This committee has also advanced my bill to increase transparency around foreign-owned communication licensees. Earlier this Congress, I introduced the FACT Act, which requires the Federal Communications Commission to publicly identify companies that hold FCC licenses that are owned by adversarial governments. I'm proud it passed the Senate in October, and I look forward to seeing it become law. As we grow more connected, we feel the impacts of network insecurity globally, nationally, and locally. Just last month, Kearney Public Schools in Kearney, Nebraska, experienced a major cyber attack that disrupted phone and computer systems. We also witnessed a series of 911 system outages across Nebraska, with multiple failures caused by a lack of network diversity and redundancy. As global conflict increases, networks that span international borders are also prime geopolitical targets for bad actors seeking to create economic and political instability. Undersea cables carry more than 95% of international internet traffic, including sensitive financial and governmental data. Recent physical cuts to those cables, both accidental and intentional, have caused disruptions worldwide, knocking millions of people and businesses offline, including major cloud services. And as we look to space, satellite constellations are rapidly expanding. With over 10,000 active satellites in orbit, most operated by United States companies, these systems support at-home connectivity, national security functions, and critical infrastructure. We must ensure foreign adversaries do not infiltrate these systems for espionage or other nefarious purposes. Across all these domains, threat actors are growing more aggressive and persistent. Today's hearing allows us to deepen our understanding of these threats and ensure our networks remain secure. There is no single solution to the network security challenges ahead. However, I hope today that we will shed light on different approaches that this committee can champion. I look forward to the discussion. Senator Lujan, you are recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you. And first off, I want to recognize and thank Chair Fischer for her leadership in calling this hearing today on a critical issue facing us all across America. I want to thank our witnesses as well for being here. I think every member on this committee can agree that there's nothing more important than keeping our communities and our country safe. That's why the security of our communication networks is vital. The networks are the foundation of our daily lives. They carry our phone calls, texts, internet traffic, health information, emergency services, and so much more. It's also our responsibility to ensure that foreign actors like China cannot infiltrate our infrastructure or steal Americans' data. There's clear evidence that foreign adversaries, including nation-state actors, are escalating their efforts to infiltrate and compromise our networks. The Salt Typhoon hacks from last year exposed fundamental weaknesses in our telecom infrastructure. That attack breached major carriers such as Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile, and compromised millions of individuals' information. This attack also likely represents the largest telecommunications hack in our nation's history. About a year ago, we examined this very topic in this very committee room. Yet, a year later, our communication networks are no more secure. And we can see that it's not just the major carriers. I'm also concerned that schools, hospitals, libraries, police departments, and emergency responders are all exposed and do not have the resources to defend themselves against foreign adversaries. I'm also extremely concerned that the Federal Communications Commission rushed to dismantle efforts taken under the last administration to verify the security of America's networks. The FCC stripped these protections away, replacing them with voluntary pledges and handshakes with companies whose networks have already proven themselves to be vulnerable to data breaches. To put it plainly, these companies are basically leaving their front doors unlocked after a data break-in, and the FCC has decided to take their word when they promise they've installed deadbolts and security cameras. It's deeply troubling. By removing enforceable standards, the FCC is weakening our national security at a time when our communications and digital landscapes are growing like never before. There's still a lot we don't know about the damage done by the Salt Typhoon hacks. In fact, President Trump fired the board that was investigating the attack. But what we do know is that rolling back protections and requirements to harden our networks is putting us on a dangerous path, and it will not prevent or mitigate attacks like this in the future. There'll be more attacks. That's certain. This should not be a partisan issue. This is a matter of national security. We're fortunate to have an expert panel with us today who will speak to the vulnerabilities in our communication system and how we can address them to protect our constituents. I look forward to productive conversation today, and again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. I'm very fortunate to have my friend as the ranking member on this committee, and I thank you for your comments and look forward to important work that we can do together. I would like to introduce our witnesses now today. Our first witness is Robert Mayer, Senior Vice President of Cybersecurity and Innovation at USTelecom. In this role, Mr. Mayer leads the association's efforts on cyber and national security. Our second witness is Daniel Gizinski, President of Comtech's Satellite and Space Communications segment. In his capacity, Mr. Gizinski leads efforts to advance Comtech's strategy and growth as the company focuses on next-generation satellite solutions. Our third witness is Jamil Jaffer, founder and executive director of the National Security Institute. He also serves as an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And our final witness is Deborah Jordan, former chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission. Mr. Mayor, you are recognized to give your opening statement.
Thank you. Chair Fischer, Ranking Member Lujan, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm Robert Mayer, Senior Vice President of Cybersecurity and Innovation at USTelecom, the Broadband Association. I also serve as the chair of the Communications Sector Coordinating Council at the Department of Homeland Security. This subcommittee knows the economic, national security, and social value of our nation's communications infrastructure and what we bring to communities around the nation. And while we invest billions in protecting our networks and our customers, nations, including China, Russia, and Iran, leverage their capabilities to infiltrate our infrastructure in pursuit of geopolitical and economic gains. Defending against such attacks requires a whole-of-government coordination and deep and enduring trust between the private sector and the government when sharing information. It also requires, when appropriate, our government to push back on our adversaries by imposing costs through diplomatic, economic, cyber, and military means that mirror the scale and sophistication of our adversaries. Congress can help to advance this mission by pursuing several core principles and action steps. First, the public-private partnership model should be preserved and strengthened. It's flexible, evolves with the threat, supports actionable remediation, and it encourages early and candid reporting. Second, cybersecurity frameworks must be flexible and adaptive. While there may be a natural impulse to mandate a detailed cybersecurity checklist, such requirements lag behind adversaries who change their techniques faster than any rules can be written. And furthermore, they shift attention away from managing real risk to managing paperwork, while our adversaries have already moved on. The goal is not less oversight, it is oversight and measures whether our nation's defenses are managing risk, adapting to new intelligence, shoring up our collective defense. Those are the outcomes that strengthen national security, cybersecurity the most. Third, under National Cyber Director Sean Carencross's leadership, the forthcoming National Cybersecurity Strategy is expected to strengthen consequence-based responses and deepen public-private coordination, an approach we strongly support. Congress must reinforce that direction by restoring durable information sharing authorities and pass a long-term reauthorization of the CISA 2015 framework. At the same time, Congress and federal agencies should prioritize maximizing existing funding mechanisms. For example, BEAD, non-deployment funds, and related federal or state initiatives should be strategically leveraged to strengthen the capabilities of local and regional providers, including the retirement of vulnerable end-of-life equipment and support for cyber workforce development, ensuring that smaller providers have sustained access to trained personnel who can effectively manage the evolving threat environment. Congress and the administration must also accelerate efforts to speed up deployment of more secure and resilient fiber broadband networks through much-needed broadband permitting reform legislation, as well as supporting efforts to retire copper and reform network modernization rules. Finally, cybersecurity requires a whole-of-society approach with shared responsibility that must be borne at all levels across the private and public sectors. USTelecom and our members and the sector writ large remain committed to working shoulder to shoulder with our government partners and Congress to outpace our adversaries and to protect the infrastructure that Americans rely upon every day. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Gizinski, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Chair Fischer, Ranking Member Lujan, members of the subcommittee, appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. America's communications infrastructure is under increasing pressure from foreign adversaries who are using advanced techniques to infiltrate, disrupt, and exploit our networks. Satellite communications are a critical part of that infrastructure. Satellites have long served a quiet but critical role in supporting global communications, and over the past few years, we've seen a tremendous pace of innovation, including the emergence and build-out of large-scale, non-geostationary orbit constellations, such as SpaceX's Starlink, Amazon's LEO constellation, and many others. We've also seen the emergence of the direct-to-device market, connecting smartphones and other small devices directly to satellites with companies like Apple, AST Space Mobile, and Link Global. One of the unique benefits of satellites is the global reach, which also increases the attack surface of those systems. Many of the satellites providing coverage to the United States expose network traffic far outside of our borders. Yet we've seen that the cybersecurity practices in this sector haven't kept pace. A recent study by researchers at the University of California at San Diego and the University of Maryland showed the ability to intercept sensitive traffic across a number of satellites. Other published studies explore some of the risks satellites are exposed to across their space segment, user segment, and ground segment, each with unique considerations and complexities. In the case of the space segment, components are typically not accessible following launch, which limits the ability to field certain updates. While there are certain fixes available for certain use cases, what I refer to as common sense cyber hygiene, things like enabling encryption either on the satellite modem or in line, serve as a low cost and simple step and something that we recommend to our customers. We note that many of the existing satellite security compliance frameworks that are in place today also recommend this, but despite that, we still see many networks operated without this key protection step in place. Strong cyber posture can be built effectively with a framework that brings together both government and industry to share threat intelligence, align incentives, and respond quickly to emerging risks. Protection requirements should be aligned with risk, understanding that not all data requires the same treatment. Our adversaries are looking forward in their approach to developing attacks, and our defense posture should reflect that. First, we must promote information sharing, both amongst government and within industry. Establishing a broad forum that allows for free and open information sharing has strong industry support, including from the Satellite Industry Association, who represents a number of domestic satellite industry members. Second, we should consider how to move beyond rigid compliance-only frameworks towards incentive-based models. Static checklists and controls are inherently rearward-facing, whereas a balanced model would allow for industry to be rewarded for a forward-looking security posture, offering incentive for those that invest in proactive security measures or contribute meaningfully towards collaborative threat mitigations that benefit the sector at large. This cultural shift will be key to promoting innovation and security that keeps pace with the rate of commercial innovation. Third, cybersecurity must be designed in from the foundation. This means building subcomponents to be secure by design and including the supply chain in threat sharing and mitigation planning. It also means ensuring that security frameworks extend to hardware and software vendors with close attention paid to the source of these critical subcomponents. Satellite connectivity supports a wide range of critical daily services, and it is playing a central role in helping expand connectivity access to underserved communities. It's also a key enabler of defense and emergency response operations and continuing to drive innovation across many other industries. The cyber threats that this sector faces are real, and they're evolving quickly. If we want to ensure the long-term resilience and security of the sector, we need to give it the attention it deserves.
Thank you, Mr. Gizinski. Mr. Jaffer, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Fischer, Ranking Member Lujan, members of the subcommittee, thank you for taking the time and for having me here to testify today. The unfortunate fact is that we are at war in the cyber domain today. It is a low-level war. Our adversaries are coming after us day in and day out. The attacks on our system and our communications infrastructure are constant. China, for one, has engaged in a wide-scale effort to penetrate every aspect of America's telecommunications infrastructure, from wireline to wireless, from undersea cables to our satellite infrastructure. They are in a constant effort to come after us. Russia is similar. Since 2019, Russia has had the capability to conduct disruptive and destructive attacks according to the Director of National Intelligence. China has now begun deploying that capability as well, primarily overseas, but also here in the United States. This is an important point. It's important because at this time in our nation's history, we must remember that President Xi has told his armed forces to be prepared to invade Taiwan by 2027. If in fact President Xi makes good on that effort, and if the United States decides to push back, we may very well be in a shooting war with China in the very near future. That shooting war will not only be in that domain, it will take place in the cyber domain as well. China will engage in efforts to not only surveil American systems, but to go after them aggressively. And if they have and have put in place this destructive and disruptive capabilities that we've seen since Full Typhoon was in place, they will use those capabilities to our detriment. It's not just China and Russia, though. Iran and North Korea as well have begun building up their cyber capabilities and are becoming serious and capable actors. And unlike China and Russia, it is much harder to deter nations like Iran and North Korea. Of course, in the cyber domain, there are a lot of people who believe that deterrence is not successful or not possible. But the reality is that we don't practice deterrence in the cyber domain to defend our communications infrastructure. The reality is that our adversaries don't know where our red lines are. They don't know what we would do if those red lines are crossed. And to the extent that we do enforce our red lines on occasion in the cyber or telecommunications domain, we don't do it in a way that other adversaries can see. As a result, the deterrent effect is limited. If we're going to successfully prevent China and Russia and Iran and North Korea from taking action against our telecommunications infrastructure, we must make it clear to them at a governmental level that we will view an attack on our communications infrastructure as an attack on our nation and will respond accordingly. Beyond that, there are big debates about what we should do about hacks like Salt Typhoon, where the Chinese government was successfully able to infiltrate and deeply penetrate our telecommunications infrastructure. On one hand, you have the prior FCC action seeking to effectively and aggressively regulate our telecommunications infrastructure. On the other hand, you have a voluntary approach adopted by the current FCC chairman. And in the middle, you have a question about what the government should have done about Salt Typhoon. We've now learned that the government actually identified the Salt Typhoon attackers before they came after our telecommunications infrastructure. We also knew that for years, China had been targeting our telecommunications infrastructure and had not successfully gotten as deep as they expected. In many ways, this is like what happened before 9/11. We knew the attack was coming. We knew it was being planned. We didn't know where. We'd even identified operatives in Kuala Lumpur. We just didn't know they were coming to the United States. The same was true in Salt Typhoon. We knew they were coming after our infrastructure. They were in our networks. We had seen them. We didn't realize what they were doing to our telecommunications industry. And the question is, why didn't the government take more aggressive efforts to protect its own information, its own infrastructure, and our nation's infrastructure? And why today is the government's position that we should aggressively regulate rather than partnering to effectively achieve success? These are difficult questions. But the truth is, if we don't answer those questions today, in the relative peace of the current moment, even in the low-level war that we're in, we will face significant and effective attacks on our infrastructure by our adversaries if and when that day comes to pass. We cannot allow that day to come to pass, and that is why, in this moment, it makes sense to find ways to partner going forward. The first and most effective thing Congress can do is to reauthorize the Cyber Information Sharing Act that was passed in 2015 and was recently reauthorized for a brief period as part of the government reopening effort. But that law can be strengthened. There are those in the Senate who would actually reduce the effectiveness of those laws and would limit their scope. The right thing to do here actually is to expand their scope, provide more liability and regulatory protection, and provide incentives to our industry to do better and be more effective. If we can partner more effectively and really build truly on a public and private partnership, that is how we'll be most successful in defending our communications and our technology infrastructure at this important time in our nation's history. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jaffer. Ms. Jordan, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chair Fischer, Ranking Member Lujan, Chair Cruz, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm grateful to have served nearly 10 years at the Federal Communications Commission as a deputy and then bureau chief for the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. My responsibilities included national security, cybersecurity, and resilience of the communications sector. As a career civil servant, I was honored to have served under 4 commission chairs from both parties. Before joining the FCC, I spent 3 decades as a civilian with the U.S. Navy. There I implemented the Navy's first ever cybersecurity framework for critical systems such as electrical, water, and wastewater. A little over a year ago, while I was at the FCC, the U.S. uncovered Salt Typhoon as a sophisticated campaign sponsored by the Chinese government. We now know that they infiltrated 9 of our nation's largest communications providers and at least 200 other U.S. organizations, including government agencies. They exfiltrated millions of calls and text messages and metadata of targeted individuals, including then candidates President Trump, Vice President Vance, then Vice President Harris, as well as members of Congress. Additionally, they compromised systems that logged U.S. law enforcement requests for criminal wiretaps, potentially tipping off Chinese intelligence about American investigative targets. And if Salt Typhoon doesn't make you shudder, let's go back a little further in time to Volt Typhoon. Active since at least 2021, but not revealed until much later, the attack was attributed to Chinese hackers who gained widespread access to critical infrastructure like comms, water, and power systems. They used a tactic known as living off the land, where they stole credentials, quietly used administrative accounts to collect data, and retain high-level access to networks. They remain in the networks in preparation for potential armed conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. These attacks highlight the vulnerabilities in our communications networks, which provide the foundation of trillions of dollars of economic activity. So how do we secure our communications networks, which serve as the underpinnings of our modern digital society? We can either lean forward, leveraging flexible cyber standards to support our nation's economy and security, or we can sit back and wait for the inevitable next attack to happen. After the revelation of Salt Typhoon, the FCC leaned forward in January of 2025. The FCC ruled that Section 105 of the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA, requires telecom providers to secure their networks against unlawful access. Also, the FCC proposed rules that would require communications providers to certify that they have created and implemented an up-to-date cyber risk management plan, which would strengthen network defenses from future cyber attacks. However, on November 20th of 2025, the FCC reversed the ruling, withdrew the proposed rules, putting the nation at risk. The FCC cited engagement with providers and, quote, their agreement to take extensive steps to protect national security interests, unquote. However, the FCC does not cite any process by which the providers will be held accountable to meet specific commitments. From my experience as Bureau Chief, I'm not convinced that providers will take sufficient and sustained actions in the wake of Volt and Salt Typhoon without a strong verification regime. As things stand now, we can hope that providers are taking appropriate steps long-term, and hope is not really a strategy to secure our networks. So what can Congress do? I have 3 recommendations. First, we have tools such as the Cyber Risk Management Framework developed by NIST. Congress should encourage the FCC to require the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or similar guidance for all telecom providers. The framework is flexible and developed in collaboration with industry and the public to assist organizations to manage and reduce cyber risks. Second is to upgrade our communications infrastructure. Keeping communications infrastructure current is critical, but also costly. I encourage Congress to fully fund communications infrastructure, such as Next Generation 911 and cyber funding for state, local, tribal, and territorial entities. We can't enable modern digital network security when running on old analog infrastructure. And lastly, verification must be a part of trust. We must establish a verification regime to ensure the security of our nation's communications infrastructure. We've seen time and again where providers have not implemented even some of the most basic cyber hygiene consistently across their networks, such as changing default passwords. Industry says they're committed to implementing extensive cyber protections, so let's establish a regime and a secure setting for them to share their progress and further plans. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. We've been joined by the Chairman of the Commerce Committee, Senator Cruz. Would you like to make some opening remarks, sir?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank you for holding this hearing. We have a distinguished panel before us, and I want to thank each of our witnesses for being here to share your expertise. In our digital age, communication networks form the cornerstone of our economy and our national security. That makes them a top target not only for criminals seeking financial gain, but also for our adversaries. America's enemies have learned that they don't need to launch missiles or deploy troops to harm the United States. Instead, they can use teams of skilled and well-resourced cyber hackers to steal our intellectual property, to gather intelligence, and to hide within critical infrastructure to disrupt essential services, all while maintaining plausible deniability. 2025 has been a pivotal year in network security, marked by the rise of AI-empowered attacks and defenses, alongside persistent risks ranging from infrastructure sabotage to increased supply chain vulnerabilities. Incidents such as Salt Typhoon and the SIM farms recently discovered near the United Nations headquarters in New York have served as sobering reminders of how relentless and creative our adversaries continue to be. Unfortunately, there is no single silver bullet solution to address cybersecurity. Protecting America's communication networks is a complex undertaking that demands continued vigilance and cannot be reduced to rote box ticking. The United States is a primary target for cyber threats precisely because we lead the world in technological innovation. Our challenge, therefore, is to secure communications infrastructure effectively without creating excessive and useless regulation that stifles the very innovation that gives our competitive edge. That is why I commend FCC Chairman Brendan Carr for moving last month to rescind the Biden administration's misguided January 2025 declaratory ruling, which tried to shoehorn new cybersecurity mandates into a 1994 law about cooperating with law enforcement. Chairman Carr's decision to shift away from ineffective and burdensome requirements is consistent with both the Commission's legal authority and sound policy. Federal agencies cannot regulate their way into creating perfect network security, and attempts to do so will backfire. Forcing telecom carriers to chase the false security of compliance checklists instead of engaging real-world threats diverts resources away from the necessary partnerships and response capabilities that actually stop intrusions. Worse still, the legal risks these compliance regimes impose have a chilling effect, as armies of lawyers focus on avoiding lawsuits and regulatory penalties instead of information sharing and collaboration when every moment counts. To meet these evolving threats, the federal government must incentivize genuine cooperation so that communication networks can focus on anticipating the next attack, not just responding to the last one. This needs foresight and agility, and it doesn't come from imposing outdated checklists and top-down regulations. It arises from a strong partnership between the private sector and the government, working together to detect and deter attacks in real time. I'm proud of this committee's progress towards strengthening network security, but much work remains. Our efforts show that success is possible. With full funding now secured, the Rip and Replace program is removing the remaining Huawei and ZTE equipment from our networks. GPS offers another example. When threats to our positioning and timing capabilities were identified, we acted decisively by passing the National Timing, Resilience, and Security Act to establish backup systems. Now, alternative and complementary positioning, navigation, and timing systems are in development, with NTIA recently identifying at least 50 companies attempting to increase our resilience and complement this critical system. Today's hearing is an opportunity to assess the current threat landscape, identify where our defenses fall short, and explore how the federal government and the private sector together can better protect America's communications infrastructure from both foreign and domestic threats. I look forward to a productive exchange.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. We will now begin our questions for the panel, and I will start. We'll just do a 5-minute round, please. Mr. Jaffer, as you testified, the Salt Typhoon hacks proved that China obtained wide-scale access to our telecommunications network, and based on the publicly available information, what distinguishes Salt Typhoon from prior nation-state operations targeting USTelecom networks?
Thank you, Chairman Fischer. I think the most distinctive thing about Salt Typhoon is the breadth and the depth of the access the Chinese government obtained to America's telecommunications infrastructure. Now, again, only based on what we know publicly, it's clear that they were able to go after 9 telecommunications providers. It appears that they actually obtained access to either our law enforcement or potentially our foreign intelligence surveillance systems at some level, whether it was the collection or the task targets or what, we don't know the details. But if you think about what that means, that depth of access and that sustained access to that sensitive information is massively damaging, not just to our communications capabilities, but to our national security. And so this is the real challenge, is the depth and breadth of the access they obtained.
How difficult is it to be able to detect that? And what does that tell us about the current existing capabilities that we have to monitor?
Well, look, we obviously were able to eventually find them, but it took us too long. We now have assessed that they were in those systems or were targeting those systems since at least 2021, or were at least going after them. Now, we don't know when they got in. The other real problem is that once they got in, they burrowed so deep, we're not sure whether we can or have gotten them all out completely. They may still very well be in our systems. At least one provider suggested they've successfully removed the actors they know about. The question is, how deep are those actors in our systems and how sustained is their access? So we weren't able to detect them when they came in. Could we have? Possible. Certainly we had plenty of warning that they were coming after our systems. And the government, this is what's crazy to me, the government actually now has admitted that it identified them in different systems. It didn't realize they were the Salt Typhoon hackers. But now, having connected them to these hackers, they now realize they actually saw
Easier
them.
then? Is it easier now to be able to detect from lessons learned?
Well, look, certainly every day that goes by, we learn more about the adversary, we learn more about our capabilities, we develop new capabilities. The advent of AI, while it provides a significant benefit to the offense, also provides a significant benefit to defenders as well. We should be deploying that at scale. The real challenge today, though, remains that we remain in a situation of sort of blaming the victim, right? In this case, we're saying, look, it's the telecom companies, they didn't do their part, they didn't update their systems, and there may be serious problems there and things that need to be addressed. But beyond that, the question is, what did the government know about the attacks? Why did it identify the attackers in different systems and not take action to find them everywhere else they were, having found them once? And why didn't it share that information effectively with the private sector rapidly? I mean, this is the kind of thing, this is like the CIA identifying Khalid Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi in Kuala Lumpur and not telling the FBI that they had visas to come to California, to come to the United States.
You know, I mentioned the FACT Act and the bill that I passed here in the Senate. How concerned should we be about China in our hardware?
Well, look, there's no question that we need...
In core networks, briefly.
There's no question that we need to go after the Chinese in this space. They are absolutely targeting those core networks. They have spent a lot of time trying to get into our hardware and infiltrate our supply chains. I think the FACT Act is a great piece of legislation. We need to get it enacted as soon as possible, but we need to go even further. We really have got to get aggressive about identifying the fact that China's infiltrate our infrastructure, not just through hardware itself, but through the chips as well, right? China has a huge supply of large format chips. They're trying to get advanced chips as well. They're on the path to it. They're not going to get EUV for a while, but they are going to use advanced EUV, and that's a problem.
You know, Mr. Mayor, as we're looking here in Congress to be able to remove a lot of that risky telecom gear from our networks currently, what policies do you think we need to prioritize with regard to supporting manufacturing of our domestic or our trusted ally equipment here so we don't run into a lot of the situations that Mr. Jaffer was referring to?
So to set the stage for the responding, the equipment in the telecom ecosystem is massive. It spans many continents. Overly concentrated, frankly, in an area of the world which we know is subject to disruption. Chinese have expressed their interests in terms of what they want to accomplish in that region, and there are a lot of countries that are now moving their supply chain to countries in that region also. So I think from a policy perspective, we have to understand that there's significant technology embedded in our systems. And I think what Congress did with RIP and replace was admirable because it recognized two vendors who we knew were responsible for malicious surveillance and impacting and presented a risk to our military establishments in some areas, but more importantly, an overall risk to our ability to manage and control network security. We are working.
I'm out of time. So
Okay.
briefly, can you do like a 1, 2, 3? What we need to do with our manufacturing on this?
Right. I think we have to tighten the requirements on vendors to improve cybersecurity. I think the concept of security by design is critical. We have to build it in, not bolt it on afterwards.
Okay.
And I think we need to have a very close relationship with our government intelligence community about what they discover, what's suspicious, and they have to share that with us so we can probe and help them resolve some of the insecurities in that realm. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Senator Lujan, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair Fischer. Ms. Jordan, you were at the FCC as Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau when the FCC adopted the declaratory ruling that affirmatively required telecommunication carriers to secure their networks from unlawful access and interception of communication. The FCC also proposed rules to require covered communication services providers to submit an annual certification attesting that they created, updated, and implemented cybersecurity, supply chain risk management plans, things of that nature. Can you explain briefly why the FCC moved forward with the declaratory ruling and advanced additional proposals earlier this year?
As I mentioned earlier, Part of what Salt Typhoon did was gain access into our law enforcement requests and records, giving China access to our administrative proceedings against adversaries. And so, as I mentioned, Section 105 of Scalia, which is System Security and Integrity, requires that they secure the systems from unauthorized access. So it was basically re-emphasizing that. With regard to the cyber risk management framework, the CSF that was developed by NIST, I think it's being referred to as a checklist, and I kind of take exception to that. It is a risk management plan. Yes, there are a number of steps that you go through. Do you have governance? Are you changing and not using default passwords? Are you assessing your risk against a number of things like installing patches in a timely manner? You know, the FCC just recently released another warning to the EAS, the alerting systems, that they need to patch their systems because, again, they've been hacked. And so that proposal that was pulled back to implement the cybersecurity framework is already in place, voted unanimously in the past several years for portions of the communication sector. In fact, in August, it was proposed for subsea cable licensees to be required to do similar cyber risk management planning. So again, it's not a checklist. It's do your cybersecurity in a methodical, planned way and keep track of what you're doing so that you know internally, your leadership knows, and you can share it when asked, whether Congress or the FCC were to ask.
Now, Ms. Jordan, with that being said, a couple of weeks ago, the proposals were off the table after the Trump FCC voted along party lines to rescind these rulings. Has the FCC proposed any rules in the place of what it just rescinded to ensure that our networks are safe and secure against cyber threats?
I've not seen anything. I have seen and heard both in Robert's testimony as well as in the statements released by the FCC and the policies that industry has committed or said that they will take extensive steps. But as I mentioned during my comments, there's no assurances. We don't know what those extensive steps are. Communications networks are large, complex, and they require like significant measures to be taken to secure them. And so without some sort of accountability regime, we don't really know what they're doing, how effective it is, how widespread those measures will be. So the answer is no. There is nothing that I'm aware of that they've put in place.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Jaffer, is that correct, sir? Apologize for that. You both stressed the importance of American leadership in emerging technology such as AI and quantum in your opening statements. In this committee, this year alone, we've had multiple hearings on AI, and we often hear that we're in a race against the Chinese government. The question for both of you, yes or no, and if you want to editorialize, I'd invite you to submit that into writing. Yes or no, please. Is it possible to win a race against the Chinese government if America is constantly leaking our IP to them through hacks in our telecom networks? Mr. Mayor?
Is it possible to beat the Chinese in the AI race if there's leaks in our infrastructure?
That's the question.
Yeah, so the answer is that
Yes or no, sir? You can editorialize
yeah,
all that you want.
I think
volumes and volumes.
I don't think it lends itself to a yes or no
Appreciate that,
answer.
Mr. Jaffer. Appreciate that. I think that's the correct answer is no. If the Chinese government's able to get their hands on everything we're doing in the United States with IP, then what are we doing? We should just have open protocol everywhere and let them do whatever the hell they want. How can we ensure an equally strong cybersecurity standards across our network without proper federal regulation? Is it possible, yes or no, Mr. Mayor?
We can do it without federal regulation. The regulation is a prescriptive, bureaucratic, static approach to a problem. It doesn't solve the environment we're in today.
So you're suggesting it can be done voluntarily?
I'm suggesting that there's a shared responsibility across all aspects of the digital ecosystem.
So if I heard you correctly earlier, you said that there should be tightening on the vendors, so there should be regulation on vendors?
There should be expectations put on vendors to.
Should there be expectations put on telecommunication companies?
There are expectations put on telecommunications
Appreciate that.
companies.
Mr. Jaffer?
I think we can do it without federal regulation, but I think the better way to do it is with is with a partnership between the public and private sector. If we incentivize the kind of behavior we want from our industry, we're more likely to get it. Let me give you just one example why. The more regulations we put on our providers, the more you're saying put the lawyers in the room and have the lawyers decide what happens. And you know what lawyers do? I'm a lawyer, recovering lawyer. We tell our clients to do the minimum necessary at the latest time possible, do only what you're required to do. If, on the other hand, you incentivize people to do the right thing, you give them tax benefits, access to government programs and the like, they're more likely to line up your boards, your CEOs, everyone's gonna be in the same room because they're gonna say, look, we get a benefit by doing these things. Give me liability protection, give me regulatory protection. Now I'm gonna tell my CISO, go share all the information you can. Now everyone's lined up in the same direction. To me, that's a more effective way to get to the goal you want, which is exactly right. We cannot win the AI race if we're leaking stuff out to China. The question is, how do we get there? Do we regulate it in place or do we incentivize it?
Thank you, Mr. Jaffer. My time's expired. If we have another round of questions, I'd like to come back. Thank you. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. Senator Blackburn, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I want to return to the subsea cable issue, which I think is so vitally important, and I had introduced the Undersea Cable Protection Act because of concerns over what was being done that would really preserve and make certain that we had these cables. Of course, attacks on these, tampering, cutting, is something that is there. Mr. Jaffer, let me come to you because I want you to talk for a minute about the vulnerability of the landing stations and the cable routes to foreign adversaries and foreign attacks and why we should prioritize these protections.
Well, Senator Blackburn, as you know, 95% of the world's internet traffic travels over these cables. 99% of transoceanic communications go over these cables. And so you're right, it's not just the cables themselves that are vulnerable, it's the landing stations as well. Talk about the cables first. You've got cable cuts that have happened. We see them in Taiwan. We see them in the Baltics. The Chinese have been dragging their anchors intentionally. We think it's intentional, certainly maybe by accident. These things can happen at times. We know for a decade the Russians have been targeting our cables for surveillance, and they're almost certainly, if they're able to get devices on the cables to tap them, they can certainly disrupt them as well. So it's a huge problem when you talk about the quantity of communications that are there. The other problem is once the cables are cut, getting capability out there to restore them is limited significantly, and that's why legislation like yours is so important. But we rely on Chinese companies to do a lot of the cable fixes, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. That's a huge problem. If these cables are cut, we're essentially blind. We've got a lot of capabilities with satellite as well, but of course, the Chinese and other adversaries are targeting our satellite infrastructure as well.
Yeah,
it's a huge
okay,
problem.
let me jump in there on the satellites. Is it Gizinski? I want to be sure I'm saying it right. Talk for a little bit about that because our primary delivery system is the subsea cables. And then you look at what we can do with the satellite capacity, and I think that what we have, satellites would offer about 50 terabytes. And, you know, we understand how indispensable this subsea infrastructure is. So talk with me about how we should look at the complementary roles of the subsea cables and then also the satellite system.
Senator, thanks for the question. I think a couple of key points. You know, certainly the capacity for satellite communications is lower than that of subsea cables, but they do provide today both core critical infrastructure on an ongoing basis as well as key disaster failover capabilities. One of the core areas of focus, though, is the same risks that are present to those subsea cables are also present to satellites. They're vulnerable to both physical, electromagnetic, and cyber attacks. It's a core area of focus, something that we've looked at closely. In many cases, those deployed and operational satellite systems are either owned and operated underneath a foreign flag, or they have a number of foreign supply components into them. That same level of attention and focus that's paid to other aspects of the infrastructure is important to pay to that core aspect of failover infrastructure as well.
Let me ask you this. Have you, by any chance, seen or are you aware of the Naval Cavitation Project at the Port of Memphis? Okay. It would be worth your time because they are looking at the underwater and also the above, and it is a wonderful project there at the Port of Memphis. Mr. Jaffer, I want to come back to you. SIM farms. I think that these SIM farms that are powering the large robocall operations and the scams, and we're seeing a lot of these. There's been a lot of talk about that this week because of Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And what are the weaknesses in our current authentication systems when it comes to isolating or actually pinpointing these SIM farms?
Yeah, well, as we've seen, we saw what happened. Chairman Cruz referred to it in his opening statement about the SIM farm that we saw up in New York during the UN hearings. You've talked about it, and the fraud that we've seen against our seniors and a lot of consumers is hugely problematic. Obviously, we need to get better on this front. The question becomes, how do you do it in a way that's effective and still deployable on our current infrastructure? And that's, I think, the hard part. We've done a lot with eSIM, and I think eSIM is significantly more secure and has the ability to be leverage to be more secure. So I think as we shift to more eSIMs, that'll make it more effective. The challenge will become, the adversary is always going to make a move, right? The offense is always going to have an edge. The best you can do as a defender is hope to keep up. And with the advent of modern technology and AI in particular, people worry that the offense is going to get a lot better. But I believe actually it will allow our defense to get just as good and to keep up more effectively. And so I think applying those capabilities in the authentication domain is particularly important, not just, by the way, for SIMs, but for regular internet authentication as well, financial transactions and the like. We've seen the pivot to passkeys from passwords. That's a significant move. I think that's going to be empowered by our newfound AI capabilities.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Rosen, you are recognized.
Well, thank you, Chair Fischer, Ranking Member Lujan, for holding such an important hearing. It's really critically important because the security of our telecom industry is not only essential, I believe, for our national security, but also for closing the digital divide, because connectivity must be secure and resilient, as we've all been talking about, for it to be successful. And I appreciate the discussion on Salt Typhoon. We need to be sure that we protect ourselves in every way possible, building on our satellites and our undersea. But I'm going to move on to something you just touched about, artificial intelligence and our threat environment. Because AI tools have made it easier than ever for threat actors to create realistic and sophisticated attacks to gain access to sensitive systems, to our valuable data. And even without the use of AI, we continue to see cyber attacks with increasing frequency. In August, Nevada was hit with a devastating cyber attack, crippling its agencies, while the state worked with CISA and the FBI to track down the cyber criminals and secure Nevada's data. Thankfully, the state made a full recovery. It appears that no sensitive data was taken. But Ms. Jordan, I'm going to start with you. In this environment, with threats from cyber attacks growing every day, what is the risk of having a reactive federal response rather than proactively encouraging and in some cases requiring certain levels of cybersecurity for our critical sectors?
Thank you for the question. The risk is high, and the consequences are severe. We saw Salt Typhoon. There could be things that happen that are even worse than that, or Salt Typhoon could continue, they could be continuing to exfiltrate information.
And so we've cut resources at CISA. We disbanded Cyber Safety Review Board. So how is this impacting what we're able to do?
It is of great impact. I think to CISA with them putting out guidelines, them putting out known exploited vulnerabilities, sharing the patches and the criticality. In other words, you should do this one really soon because it's a high vulnerability. This one maybe can wait a little longer. And so without that information sharing that my colleagues have been talking about is limited.
CISA is that bridge between public and private, between our grid and all of that. It is important that we don't just get rid of CISA.
I think so, yes.
And so, people have talked about the incentives for current telecom companies to ensure their networks are secure. Common sense cyber hygiene, all the kinds of things that you spoke about, encryption, dual-factor authentication, passkeys. Ms. Jordan, again, I'm going to ask you, are there any federal programs that incentivize smart cyber practices? And what do you think about those? Quickly, because I have another question to ask Mr. Mayor.
Yes, I'm not aware of any that incentivize other than regulations that require. I think if there were incentives, I would be in favor of them alongside an accountability regime like light regulation that looked at incentivization as well.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I'm going to move on to you. In an AI-enabled threat environment, what can Congress do to help secure our networks? For example, some have suggested additional funding to support carriers and ISPs, ensuring that they have adequate cybersecurity protections. Quickly, I have one more question for a former Nevadan, I believe, worked for Sierra Nevada Corporation, but how do you think we can provide that support here in Congress?
I think you have to encourage innovation, not regulation. We had an incident 2 weeks ago reported by Anthropic that for the first time, using commercial off-the-shelf AI platforms, they were able to initiate a cyber attack. 80% of that attack didn't require human intervention. It was fully executed by an AI platform that is currently commercially available. Over time, that 80% is going to move towards 100%. That's the environment we're in. There is no way that a prescriptive checklist regulation is going to allow us to innovate in the way we need to innovate to address that threat.
So investing in public-private partnerships and innovation in our universities, our research institutions, and with our private companies would be, in your advice, reasonable?
Reasonable, vastly superior, and should be encouraged by Congress.
Thank you. I have one last question about U.S. leadership in the telecom industry. It's essential to securing our network. We have to be on that leading edge of innovation, maintaining our U.S. leadership in international settings standards. So, Mr. Gizinski, you work for defense companies like Sierra Nevada Corporation, which is proudly headquartered in Sparks, Nevada. Can you speak to the importance of ensuring we have secure and resilient communication networks? How important is it to national security and U.S. jobs if we do not have a strong cyber posture across critical infrastructure sectors like telecom?
Senator, thanks for the question. It's critically important that we have a secure cyber infrastructure. One of the core areas that I've looked at and thought about quite a bit in this is promoting that culture throughout the defense industrial base of leaning forward and adopting strong cyber practices. I think that's something that we've seen some adoption, driving towards strong incentive programs, encouraging the innovation that is being harnessed today to deliver next generation technical innovations. We're seeing in the satellite industry the launch of thousands of new satellites a year. That same innovation should be harnessed and driven to secure our cyber posture as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Schmidt, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow up on that a little bit, Mr. Jaffer, in December, I had called for an investigation in the Department of War handling of the post-Salt Typhoon risk. In particular, the department's failure to ensure its communications, voice, text, video were protected from foreign espionage vulnerabilities. In your view, what are the structural problems in federal procurement that make it possible, or I should say, what should Congress consider as far as the federal procurement process to make that better?
Well, Senator Smith, certainly I think that the procurement system is one place where Congress and the executive branch can do a lot more to ensure effective cybersecurity. In the procurement process, because you're spending our taxpayer dollars and people want these contracts, we can impose whatever requirements we want on them. To me, that's a much more preferable way to address the regulatory burden that folks want to put on industry. It's because if people want government contracts, they should secure the systems to the government standards. At the same time, we're seeing the Department of War today pivot to a much more innovative approach to procurement, a much more commercial approach to procurement. I think that's the right thing to do. It allows us to get newer, better technology in faster. And there we have to make sure that we're not overimposing cybersecurity burdens that will prevent us from getting the technology we want. There's a balance there that we can achieve, I think one that we can do successfully as we need to going forward.
I agree in the sense that we have a lot of leverage as it relates to those contracts. In your view, what are some of the minimum cybersecurity standards or audit compliance that should be included in those contracts?
What I do think we should do is require companies that sell to the federal government to go through a security audit and to demonstrate to an independent third party that they've successfully met things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? That they're applying it effectively and they're implementing it effectively. That to me is a good starting point. If they're able to show that to the government doesn't need to do additional work on its own to qualify them. They can do that ahead of time. They can get the audit paperwork, present to the government, and then become a contractor much faster. To me, that's a way to get smaller, faster companies in and not put an additional federal regulatory burden upon them while still requiring them to meet good cyber hygiene requirements like the NIST framework.
Mr. Mayor, I wanted to ask you, in your testimony, you emphasized that prescriptive regulations cause us to lag behind adversaries for a bunch of different reasons. You warned that this shift in attention from managing real risk to managing paperwork means provider can legally and fully be compliant, but still be very exposed. Can you speak to the impact that we've seen already from the previous administration's more prescriptive, checklist-driven approach, what that's kind of left behind, and what we can learn from that moving forward?
So we know that the checklist, and we have evidence of this, have not been successful. There are examples where individuals or organizations that do a checklist managed by checklists, they miss things. And in this environment where the adversaries are evolving on a daily basis, using a checklist would, in a sense, be looking in a rearview mirror. We've heard talk about the flexibility in the NIST framework. That was designed to withstand the test of time. It's worked over a decade. So I think the better approach, and we're doing this, is to engage with our government partners on a regular basis, including the intelligence community and the law enforcement community, and talk about what we're observing, what the government is observing, how to mitigate those activities. And we do hold ourselves accountable. I can tell you the frontline practitioners in our companies work every day to defeat these attacks. We don't hear about their success rate, but they are dedicated and passionate about security, and they are held accountable within their organizations to their customers. And finally, I'd say in the context of contracts, that's a legitimate avenue for negotiations to talk about the security requirements that are needed, and we've been doing that for years through service level agreements and other ways to reach an understanding of what's expected.
So with the 43 seconds that I have remaining, I just throw kind of two questions out for whoever wants to grab on them, because I do think these are important. What we learned, I think, from Salt Typhoon is that there's a lot of deficiencies in the hardware that currently exists that's outdated, and I know there's efforts to sort of update that. Can you give me an update on where that stands, and why, as it relates to satellite security, what are some, just simple things like enabling encryption? Why are we not further along with that? So hardware issues and updating that, and then encryption for satellites.
So I think a couple of aspects, certainly on the hardware side, major area of emphasis, and ultimately very important to pay attention to the supply chain of not just the hardware, but the software that's going into those systems, putting together transparent messaging around the source of all of the software aspects that are incorporated into in deliverable systems. There are a number of explanations that have been provided for some of the complexities that are created by enabling encryption. I would say it's a little bit of a surprise, and I think there's probably further discussion needed on some of the limitations that are preventing encryption from being broadly used on satellite. It's something that we've strongly advocated for. We've made those tools available to many of our customers that are using that equipment over satellite links. And we're still seeing to this day that equipment not being enabled, that feature not being turned on, and those links being left out in the clear. Do you think a part of the driver for that, this shift towards the concept of a zero trust architecture where each system and subsystem is assumed to be untrusted hasn't been fully adopted across the satellite industry more broadly? Certainly appears to be potentially a misunderstanding of who's responsible for that layer of security in the overall system.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. Senator Hickenlooper, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here. I appreciate all the work you're doing. It's a broad context. When I was finishing my first term as governor of Colorado, we did an economic development trip around Asia, and it ended up in Israel. So we just saw a lot of the technologies you are all familiar with. We also saw Israel's ability to connect the military with their academic research in their universities with their entrepreneurs. And we have a National Center for Cybersecurity in Colorado Springs that tries to pick up on that. But I think that's an arc just as we discuss these issues. Just to continue what Senator Schmidt was asking, and maybe I'll turn to Ms. Jordan on this. Colorado's critical infrastructure, from energy facilities to military installations, top to bottom, depends on secure communication links. And we know that adversaries are constantly trying to interrupt and disrupt our communications, penetrate our national security in every way they can. In your view, what are the largest gaps in federal-state information sharing on security as threats to our communications?
So I think that information sharing in general is important, both among industry and the government, and it should include state and local, for instance, state fusion centers, along with the federal intelligence communities. And where that's not happening, that's a big gap. I think that understanding what the threats are, implementing even the most basic cybersecurity hygiene, updating the patches to software and those kinds of things are critical.
So those are the easy parts. So we turn the page and we look at, as quantum advances, right? Certainly the encryption systems protecting our communication networks eventually are going to become vulnerable to rapid, can you say decryption? Is that fair? That's the right word. And this is a future threat window that is immense by most measures. Now, NIST recently published the world's first post-quantum cryptography standards that can be adopted by the US government. What you were just describing is a pretty basic blocking and tackling. We need to go to that next level. So given your experience with Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, how should the FCC begin incorporating quantum-resistant cryptography and post-quantum transition planning into its network security roles?
So it's definitely an advanced area that needs to be looked at. I agree with my colleagues on collaboration. I think that having those joint discussions with industry on how that's being rolled out, the pace at which it's being rolled out, and then looking smartly at what needs regulation, where there should be secure by design, in other words, things that are built in to products before they're deployed, and then where is there a need, for instance, the FCC hosts something called the Communications Security Reliability Interoperability Council, CSRIC. It's a partnership, and they come up with best practices. So that's like ripe for a CSRIC committee. But then when those best practices are put out, they have to be used.
Right. Well, that's the next big step. I agree. Mr. Mayor, as you know, again, Colorado is home to many entrepreneurs and research labs up and down the Front Range, and definitely on the front lines of 5G and next-gen wireless communications. But we've been working on a bipartisan fashion to finally close the shortage of funding for the FCC's RIP and replace, where we found that we had a lot of infrastructure that was not secure as we would like. The Salt Typhoon showed how deeply adversaries can burrow into our communications networks. How can Colorado's rural broadband providers, which operate on very thin margins, benefit from additional federal guardrails or minimum cybersecurity baselines to make sure we don't have similar breaches?
Well, I think, sir, that the notion of doing basic hygiene is very important. And my experience is that the companies understand that and they're basically implementing that. The challenge for the rural providers is not having the resources that the larger providers have. So you're asking basically is a local telephone operation to be able to compete against a nation state that's throwing everything everywhere all the time on these networks. They view those providers as access points to the entire ecosystem, and they exploit that. And we've seen that with Salt Typhoon, how that works. So I think the other opportunity for us is there's $20 billion in non-deployment BEAD funding. Cybersecurity would be an excellent way to invest that money, both in cybersecurity workforce development training, and also the fact that there are legacy technologies. Rip and replace was a great start. The list is getting bigger.
Right. No, I agree. No, I agree. I'm out of time. Mr. Gizinski, we'll get back to, I got a couple questions for you. I'll put it in the written questions, but appreciate all of you being here. Thank you for your service. Yield back the floor, sorry.
Thank you, Senator Hickenlooper. As a senator, you don't have to yield back time when you're finished. Thank
Really?
you. Thank you works.
Well, I was out of time, so thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm doing a rules thing now, too. Thank you. Senator Capito, welcome. You are recognized.
Thank you, Senator Fischer, and thank you all for holding this hearing. Nice to see you. I'm all the way over here. Mr. Meyer, you kind of got into what one of my question was going to be, but let me begin with this. The BEAD program that was just, the West Virginia application was just okayed by the NTIA several weeks ago, and if you followed it, you probably know that the original $1.2 billion that was allotted for West Virginia, which was quite large for a small state, is now $600 million to deliver the BEAD program in West Virginia after it had been rebid and everything. I guess, in my opinion, where do you think, and I think you already mentioned this, but if we could flesh it out a little bit more, with those extra dollars that are allotted for broadband, it seems to me that cybersecurity and other areas, you mentioned workforce, training, where would you see, I'd like to keep those dollars captured for the deployment and the safety of broadband, particularly the rural broadband. So if you could expound on that a little bit more.
So I think we can do both. It's very important to use that money for broadband deployment, especially in the rural areas of the country. We need to make sure that these citizens are not left out of the revolution that's underway, AI and all of that. I think there's a general understanding that the nature of the threat environment right now is different. It's becoming much more urgent that we have resources available to support that community. So I think what we're talking about is targeted funding with full accountability in areas that these companies can, and they know, you know, we need this system, or we can use this mechanism, or we need these professionals to support. Have them being able to access those funds for purposes of increasing their cybersecurity, protecting their customers, protecting their networks. That's how we view it.
Well, I think, you know, for small systems, which we have in a small state like ours, some of them are small, some of them are major, and they just don't have the money to be able to do that. So then you look at, well, what are you going to do? You're going to not deploy service in a rural area because you're going to have to make a choice. And it would be nice, since in the case of West Virginia, $600 million is not going to be spent where it was initially intended to, would be, I think, a source of funds. I would like to see some more of those funds still deployed, because there's still going to be people that are left out even after the BEAD program. And those are very difficult areas, but it sounds like we're saying the same thing in terms of the affordability of a rural broadband deployment company to be able to do this. I mean, I think of it, if you think of it in terms of 9/11, where did they get in? They got in small airports where there were vulnerabilities. Same thing with cybersecurity, to take the whole system down. Which brings me to another issue. There's a lot of talk about data centers and the deployment of data centers and how critical they are in the race for AI, and critical for us to be able to take advantage of the great technologies that we have. But those are new vulnerabilities, I believe, that are going to be presented. I was thinking about undersea cables and other things. Is this something that you all, should we be designating data centers as critical infrastructure so that it can be part of how CISA and others look at our critical infrastructure? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll take that. I think to a large extent, data center infrastructure is already reflected in some of the critical infrastructure, whether that's critical manufacturing, the IT sector, the communications sector. It's in there. It's something that we take very seriously, frankly, because we're seeing evidence now that the data centers are targets. We also we saw this week or 2 weeks ago, a situation where a cooling device in a data center resulted in a massive disruption, one cooling device, affecting major e-commerce platforms and social media platforms across the globe. So there's an element of systemic risk that's built into a highly complicated, distributed network ecosystem. And I think that understanding that we're talking about attacks that are everywhere all the time, I like to talk about the fact that they're 22,300 feet in the sky, they're 4 miles underneath the surface of the sea,
Right.
and everything in between. That's the attack vector. And for us as network service providers, we're very concerned about the ability to infiltrate edge devices that don't have the appropriate security built in. They want to go to market quickly. They want to go with cheap prices. And that's why the FCC action, for example, around clean carts, which would impose expectations on the retailers to not make those faulty edge devices available to the public. That's an important step going forward, recognizing that issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Capito, and thank you for bringing up the BEAD program, which you and I worked on that infrastructure bill, and the importance of that on making sure unserved areas are connected, and hopefully that funding that was provided to our states will remain there and be able to be used for things, not just connectivity, but also the security that's needed in these programs.
I think that would be a well-placed use of the funds, and it's so necessary, certainly in light of the testimony we've heard today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Peter, oh, I'm sorry.
Is he next, or?
No, Senator Cantwell has joined us. Ranking member, welcome, Senator Cantwell. And do you have an opening comments you'd like to make or questions?
I'll just make a few comments and then get to questions.
Okay,
But thank
great,
you, Madam
thank you.
Chair. Thank you so much for holding this hearing, to you and to Ranking Member Lujan. I want to focus on Salt Typhoon. Obviously, the Chinese government's espionage operation deeply penetrated networks of at least 9 U.S. telecom companies, including AT&T and Verizon. It has been described as the worst telecom hack in our nation's history. And the Chinese government-sponsored hackers broke into our nation's telecommunications backbone. They exploited the wiretapping system that our law enforcement agencies rely on under the Communications and Assistant Law Enforcement Act, known as CLIA. These systems became an open door for Chinese intelligence. The Salt Typhoon allowed the Chinese operation to track millions of Americans' locations in real time, record phone calls at will, and read our text messages. Their targets included then candidates President Trump and Vice President Vance, as well as senior government officials. And the hackers were also able to determine who the U.S. government was wiretapping, including suspected Chinese spies, telling Beijing which of their operatives might be compromised. So how did this happen? Senior national security officials said the breach occurred in large part because telecommunications companies failed to implement rudimentary cybersecurity measures. Investigators found legacy equipment not updated in years, router vulnerabilities with patches available for 7 years that were never applied, and hackers acquiring credentials through weak password. Security professionals across the industry were shocked because this kind of basic failure would not be acceptable in healthcare or banking or in technology firms, yet here we are, the telecom system, and basically the most sensitive communications. AT&T and Verizon claimed they contained the attack, but government officials and cybersecurity experts remain deeply skeptical. The FBI said it cannot predict when we will have a full eviction of these bad actors, and even Chairman Carr acknowledging when he was rolling back the rules that protected them, quote, "we are still being exploited," end quote. Earlier this year, I wrote to the CEOs of AT&T and Verizon demanding that they provide documentation of their remedies. Both companies refused. Hardly a transparent effort. I believe that the American people deserve to know whether China is still inside our telecom networks. We deserve to know. Perhaps the most telling response in the breach came from the FBI itself. In an unprecedented step last December, the FBI and CISA urged all Americans to use encrypted messaging, basically apps like Signal, to protect their communications. Interesting. Encryption is your friend, they said. Think about that. Our federal law enforcement agencies are telling Americans you cannot trust the security of your own telephone networks. That's what they're saying. And you should use encrypted communication. So, Ms. Jordan, what level of requirements should we be putting on our wireless providers to make sure that we are getting the level of security that Americans deserve? And when we're handing them over such valuable resources like spectrum, and they're trying to constantly end run important national security DoD initiatives just to get their hands on the spectrum, what requirements should we be putting in place that really do make Americans more secure in their communications?
There must be structured cybersecurity requirements levied. I'm not talking about a checklist, which has been referred to, but cyber risk management planning and executing those plans. That has to be put in place, and it should be a requirement. The FCC has already required it of certain subsections of the communications sector. In fact, in August, this administration proposed it for subsea cable licensees. So continuing along that path, the continued partnership of industry, the telecommunications industry with government, the intelligence sector, CISA, others who know of the recent threats, and as you mentioned, doing basic cyber hygiene. You know, I would never let my iPhone go 7 years without a patch update, right? Ordering a pizza sometimes requires two-factor authentication. Why are our providers not implementing those basic hygienes? They should be held accountable, and they should be doing a structured plan and being held to a verification regime that would give you the information that you asked for and didn't receive.
Well, what about the FCC then walking back requirements additionally? Like, it's like they're supposed to be the overall entity that says, look, here's how you have these communications licenses to provide communication, yet if you're not going to do good hygiene, why should we keep your license?
Yes, I don't believe that a fallback of enforcement action is appropriate because that's after the fact. So again, they should be leveraging this requirement to use the cybersecurity framework or something similar to do structured planning and execution of cyber risk management across the entire communication sector. They shouldn't be doing it in little pieces like the EACAM or the subsea cable or this pocket.
Yep.
It should be done pervasively.
Well, the Grid NARUC is a similar organization that does this for the grid itself. Do you think that that's what we need here? Something like that where at least
I think it's worth.
there's a dynamic and input? I mean, me personally, I think we know this is the information age. We know that this is what's going to happen. So letting these guys off the hook, and when it's so much vulnerability for Americans that our FBI and law enforcement are telling us use encrypted networks, it's gotten to a point where we got to do something to better help the public. Or why have, you know, or basically you're just setting them up. You're just setting them up to say you are going to be a target.
I agree, and I think that there are some aspects of what China is doing that are nation state, and therefore even the telecom providers might not be able to stave them off. But if the providers are not doing basic hygiene across their networks consistently, then yes, they should be held accountable. I'm not saying if a nation state comes in and does something that we couldn't predict, that's a different scenario. But they should be held accountable to doing the basic hygiene, patching, not default passwords, encryption, those kinds of things.
Well, I think that's the most shocking thing, and this committee has had several hearings, and there was another big break, and that was exactly the same issue. There was a patch, it was available. You know, as we've looked at privacy laws and what you need to do if you're providing some sort of system, yeah, nothing against 21-year-old administrators, but you gotta have more hierarchy to your enforcement and capabilities on security than just hiring a bunch of very smart, talented people when you have consumers who are going to be vulnerable to these kinds of things. So we look forward to working with the subcommittee, Madam Chair, and figuring out what we can do to better protect Americans. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Senator Peters, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. Mr. Mayor, As ranking member of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, one of my biggest concerns and focuses has been on the long-term extension of authorities that are contained in the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, which I know you're very familiar with. Over 80 companies now and organizations support legislation that I'm working on with Senator Rounds in a bipartisan way, entitled Protecting America from Cybersecurity Threats Act, which would basically extend those cybersecurity threat information sharing authorities for an additional 10 years. I think we all know the last 10 years have been very successful. We need to continue to make sure that they're in place for the long term and that industry and others can rely on it. And I certainly appreciate how vocal USTelecom has been about the importance of extending this authority. But could you explain to this committee how cyber threat information sharing is absolutely critical for defending telecommunications networks, and what more do you think the Trump administration should do to help us extend this essential authority? I'm going to be hoping all my colleagues on this panel will support that and give them reasons why it's important.
It's critical. We're not going to be successful in addressing the threats that we currently face. It's been invaluable in terms of our ability to share information without concerns about liability, without concerns about punishment, enforcement. We have an excellent relationship with our government partners, the intelligence community, CISA, all of these organizations. It's grounded on this act. It's the ability for us to have conversations about what we're seeing, what they're seeing, what we're doing to mitigate the risk. These conversations are happening constantly. And I think it speaks to a broad consensus that this act has worked for 10 years. It's lapsing in the end of January if we don't deal with it. I would say it's probably the number one issue for us in the short term to, in a sense, get improved cybersecurity writ large for this nation.
So as you mentioned, it's riding along the CR, which would expire at the end of January. But tell us, riding along CRs is not the way to deal it. And why do we need that 10-year extension?
Because we don't want to do this every few years. We want to
Every few months right now.
Or every few months. Yeah, that's not good policy.
Right.
So this is a cornerstone of our ability to collaborate with government.
Great. I'm also extremely concerned, and we heard from my colleague, ranking member Cantwell, about the FCC's decision last month to roll back what are basically, I think, common sense cybersecurity rules to safeguard America's data. These rules were announced, as you know, in the wake of Salt Typhoon, and I won't go into all the challenges there. It's already been brought out before the committee. But I think without question, the rollback of these rules leaves Americans exposed and erodes our ability to prevent future attacks. I think this is even more concerning when you look at that rollback as part of a broader trend that's being carried out by the Trump administration right now, where officials say, they talk a good game, they say cybersecurity is a priority, but at the same time, they're basically gutting all of our cybersecurity institutions, from rolling back the FCC rule to ignoring their own guidelines regarding the handling of America's most sensitive personal information, as well as pushing out cybersecurity experts all across government, firing the people who know what needs to be done. So my question for you, Mr. Mayor, is the FCC rule to require telecommunications providers to have a cybersecurity plan and then stick to it, I think is pretty common sense and a step forward to ensuring cybersecurity. So my question is, why did USTelecom push the FCC to roll back these efforts in this case? And are you confident the vulnerabilities exposed inside this Salt Typhoon will not occur again in the future? But why push to roll those back?
Because they were ineffective. They would not have produced the results that we're looking for. We're not going to regulate our way out of this issue. We're going to have to innovate our way. We're going to have to match an adversary who is using the most sophisticated techniques possible. It wasn't a checklist or a compliance thing that was bypassed. It was advanced defensive capabilities that are being deployed by our member companies that were bypassed. Why? Because the Chinese are masters at stealth. They used we talk about here Salt Typhoon being identified in 2021, 2020. They used Asia-Pacific region as a testing ground for these types of techniques, these stealth techniques, on countries and organizations that were less hardened. And then they perfected it, they came to the United States, they came into our networks, they used stealth technology that is actually anti-forensic in a sense. The breadcrumbs disappear. And once they're in the network, I mean, it doesn't take more, in some cases, less than a minute to laterally move throughout the networks, operating support systems, business support systems. So we have a very sophisticated adversary, and the way to deal with this is collaboration with government, partnership with government, accountability, absolutely. And I'm in the conversations. I know how much we are talking to these different government entities, classified settings, unclassified settings, numerous venues. We're making progress, and we shouldn't stifle that or kill that with a compliance regime where you have 40 to 70% of your practitioners doing paperwork. We need to focus on the threat. We need to focus on the triage when it happens, and we are supportive of things like incident reporting that Congress passed in Cersei if it's implemented correctly.
Great. Thank you. My time has expired, but Ms. Jordan, I'm going to ask you a question related to this as to why you may think the FCC's actions were appropriate and why it may have been wrong to have those rolled back, but I'll ask that in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Young, you are recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for your interest in this topic, and I want to thank all of our panelists here today. Thank you for your thoughtful contribution as it relates to policymaking on this host of issues. You mentioned in your testimony, Mr. Jaffer, that China is increasingly engaged in undersea cable cutting activities. This is something that for a couple of years running I've had a real interest in, and as a matter of the Intelligence Committee, I'm trying to find countermeasures that might help us address this growing challenge. Subsea cables, we know, serve as the backbone to today's world communication system. So we're going to have to come up with some checks, and I believe we must adequately address these broader challenges in coming months and years. Earlier this year, relatedly, the FCC put forward rules to streamline submarine cable application reviews, protect submarine cables against national security risks, and incentivize cable build-out. In those rules, one requirement was for applicants and licensees to create cybersecurity and physical security risk management plans. Can you identify maybe other areas that should be a focus for strengthening our resiliency of subsea cable infrastructure, especially as our adversaries continue to advance tactics to do harm?
Well, Senator Young, it's a great and important question. I think the most effective way that we can prevent our adversaries from cutting cables and the like is to create more cables, to have diversity of them, have them owned by American companies, have more ships to be able to fix them, and frankly, make clear to our adversaries that if they cut our cables, we will treat it as an attack on our critical infrastructure, because that's exactly what it is. Today, adversaries largely get away with it because it's an accident, it was a mistake, we didn't know it was you, but we've watched the Russians surveil our cables. We've watched them, look at them and consider cutting. We've seen the Chinese actually do it in Taiwan and in the Baltics. One might be an accident, certainly 3 in a row is a pattern. And so when our adversaries realize that we are actually watching them and are going to do something about it, that's when they'll stop doing it. And when we build enough cables and enough access that we can rely on our own systems, and then there are other things you can do. You can do physical security. You can put them in more robust casings and the like. You can have surveillance measures down on this undersea floor. But at the end of the day, if you're really going to push back against a nation-state action, it's going to have to be nation-state response.
And we're going to have to come up with protocols, it sounds like you're saying, or expectations that we will treat this almost in domestic law like a strict liability situation, or if not strict liability, the burden of proof or production will be on whomever supposedly accidentally cut a cable, right?
That's exactly right.
Okay. Mr. Meyer, same question to you. Are there other areas that should be a focus for strengthening our resiliency as it relates to subsea cables?
Yeah, I think so. We have to make sure, and we're doing this. We're an important stakeholder in the submarine cable. The transmissions are often transmissions that we are generating and moving along both nationally and internationally, especially internationally. So we are aware of what the FCC is doing. We've had conversations with the FCC National Security Council about cybersecurity practices related to protecting, well, all practices. It's not just, it's physical as well, to how we can support enhancing, making these systems less vulnerable. But there is an inherent risk when you're putting, when there's so many, I think they're like almost 500 to 700 submarine cables. Many of these are in the Indo-Pacific region. This is China's area. The ability for them to disrupt transoceanic communications at a time when suits their needs is real and serious. And to Mr. Jaffer's point, this really requires federal engagement and activities. And we are willing and ready to collaborate with any government partner and organizations to make sure that these systems are more secure.
Well, who should bear the cost of, let's say, redundancy, right? Building out more cables. These are expensive capital investments. Would it be rational from an economic standpoint for us to say, okay, we have an idea who the greatest users of these cables are because they send data across them, across the ocean. Maybe we should put it on the companies. What would you say to that line of economic argument?
Well, I think the economic argument would be you can't impose costs that are going to make the business unprofitable and not attract investors. As you point out, you need big investment, huge investment to deploy, to maintain, to install these. The economic problem with dealing with asymmetrical issues like this is serious. And I think that this is a question for national policy in terms of what kind of assistance can we do to safeguard our infrastructure against what we're experiencing today and what we know is possible tomorrow.
Well, I think coming up with a doctrine of deterrence, just to be candid, will be as a matter of politics, internal congressional politics, and with the broader public of telecom consumers, that will be an easier sell. So maybe we should focus in the near term on what is achievable. And it seems to me a deterrence approach is eminently achievable. So thank you all, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Young. As I put out a last call for any members who are trying to get to this hearing to ask questions, Senator Lujan and I are each going to ask a final question. Mr. Gizinski, you stated that many of the satellites providing coverage to the United States expose network traffic outside of our borders. So how do we meaningfully improve encryption and security protocols across our satellite infrastructure and inconsistency that you highlighted?
It's an excellent question. I think a few key points that are critical. The first is, we see consistently, and I think this is a true point across both telecom and the satellite industry, most of the operators are not vertically integrated, and so they're heavily reliant on a supply chain to build those subsystems that go in, things that enable those encryption capabilities. It's important that we extend the threat sharing information and the opportunity down into the supply chain and ensure that we're building the right secure by design subsystems with flexible encryption protocols and other appropriate security considerations from the ground up. We've seen very publicly some of the examples where that's gone poorly, where foreign supplied components had security vulnerabilities present in them from the initial delivery. Encouraging that same approach throughout the satellite industry, I think, is incredibly important. The second point is recognizing that in most cases, the folks that are designing and building these systems have the best view of what the vulnerabilities are and may be. They can be a great partner in closing those. And we've seen consistently the application of well-intended checklists on defense systems often aren't designed with the end system architecture in mind. Having that in-depth, open conversation has been incredibly valuable in securing other systems that we've built and delivered over the years. And I think that's a great model to follow out into the future.
Thank you. And Mr. Jaffer, how severe do you think the threat is to our space systems that we have?
I mean, I think the threat is quite severe. You just look at a capability that China has. They have the SJ-21 satellite. This is a repair satellite. It's designed to remove debris. They demonstrate the ability to grapple another satellite and move it to a different orbit. Now, you think about what that could do if used in an offensive manner. That's obviously a huge problem. China has that capability. Other nations have that capability. The threat to our infrastructure is huge, and they don't even have to take out a satellite directly. They can destroy one satellite, and the debris itself, the debris field, can cause problems for our satellites. It's a huge issue in outer space. It's a real challenge, and we've got to make our satellites defensible. And part of it is having a diversity of systems, like we talked about with cables. If you can have more satellites going up faster, that's actually going to create a more resilient and more capable system. It's also going to make it more technologically efficient because we'll get newer capabilities into space faster. So the better we can get at launch, the better we can get at building smaller and faster, more capable satellites, the better off we'll be.
Thank you. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mayor, in your testimony, you said that any cybersecurity framework needs to be flexible and adaptive. I agree. Do you agree with me that the FCC has a role to play in ensuring that our communication networks are protected against cybersecurity threats?
Absolutely, yes.
Appreciate that. Now, recently, Senator Peters asked a question around USTelecom, their role, their advocacy to reverse the FCC's actions in response to Salt Typhoon. A few things that the FCC required was changing default passwords, requiring minimum password strength, adopting multi-factor authentication, and patching known vulnerabilities. All simple things. Congress is constantly told that we're behind the curve on technology, even if we have these basic protections in place. Which of these basic protections was too burdensome for your member organizations?
Senator, I think these are not, what you're describing are not burdensome.
I appreciate that. That's an answer. I appreciate that. With that being said, do your member companies have cybersecurity risk management plans?
Absolutely. They've been working on this for many, many years. They're evolving their risk management plans.
Are you willing to share those with the committee?
The risk management plans?
Yes.
No, we're in a trade association. I can't say what our members are willing to share.
So you're telling me to trust you?
I'm telling you that we're doing a lot, and we have been doing a lot, and you can ask our government partners whether they think we're doing a lot, because I do
Well, I have a
believe.
follow-up there as well, but I appreciate it. The reason I'm asking you these questions, sir, is you of all the panelists today, my constituents depend on your members every day, all day, around the clock, all day long. As a matter of fact, most of my small businesses right now just rely on the services that your member companies provide. So I'm picking on you. So I apologize for that. But it matters to my constituents. Now, earlier, there was a question asked by Senator Schmidt about requirements for contracts for the federal government to be wise around taxpayer dollars. And I heard at least two of the panelists suggest, well, that might be a good idea to require anyone doing work with the federal government to meet, is it fair to say, a floor of standards, a floor of requirements in order to safeguard taxpayer dollars? Would that be fair? Well, let me just, that's my assumption. If I'm incorrect, I'd invite you to submit into the record where I got that wrong. Now, I asked my staff to let me know how much money the federal government over the last few fiscal years has spent in a very specific area, namely in telecommunication contracts. They told me that what GAO says is 2014 and 2018, the government spent $30 billion, $30 billion for telecommunication contracts, $4 billion for call center contracts, $6 billion per year that has likely gone up, $14.3 billion for IT services for FY24 alone, $3.2 billion in IT and telecom products for FY24. I look forward to working with you all to have requirements that there's I'm not looking for an answer here. I just look forward to working with you all. That there's a floor of cyber requirements. That's a lot of money. And we talk about national security, vulnerabilities, and how we outsource all of our work to call centers. The smallest of the small in the most rural part of America that allows someone in, an actor in, infects the whole system. And so I certainly hope that these are some areas that we can get together. Last question I have, Madam Chair, is to Mr. Jaffer. You served on the Cyber Safety Review Board, CRSB, which was under the Department of Homeland Security. My question is a simple one. Was it a mistake to disband this board?
Well, we were asked to look at the Salt Typhoon hack, and because of internal government bureaucracy and decisions, we were unable to even get off the ground. We weren't able to get our clearances in time. We weren't able to do any questioning of any of the communications companies, of any of the government individuals involved. So we were tasked with the Cyber Safety Review Board review months in advance. We took months, didn't get anything done, and then the board was disbanded. Should have been disbanded? No. Should it be back? Absolutely. But even when it was in place, under the 4 or 5 months that I served on that board, we got nothing effectively done because it wasn't allowed to do its work. There were claims about, because there was a law enforcement investigation going on, because industry was partnering with the government, they couldn't talk to us. We even asked to talk to providers that said they weren't affected by Salt Typhoon. We weren't allowed to do that. So the board wasn't being used effectively. It shouldn't have been disbanded. It would be better if it was back in. But if it's going to be back in place, it needs to be used effectively. At the end of the day, I think what Congress ought to think about doing is impaneling an outside commission to look at what happened in Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon and make recommendations to you, like the 9/11 Commission did, about what we should do most effectively to get the executive branch, the legislative branch, and industry back together and work in this issue.
I'm glad I asked the question. So if in fact that body is brought back, it needs to be fixed and it needs to be effective and the tools need to be in place to be able to discover all the information, to be able to provide information to Congress. In addition to that, your recommendation now of an outside commission as well. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. I would say the problem with any commissions is by the time we get the report, it's like past due. It's past due, and it's really, really difficult to be able to get any movement forward from the recommendations that are put into place. So I look forward to working with you, Senator Lujan, in trying to figure out, as anything with the federal government, how do we cut through things and try and move quicker so that we can have private industry be able to work with the federal government to get us the information we need.
One thought, Madam Chairwoman, the other committees, the Senate Intelligence Committee, for example, has a technical advisory group that it impanels that brings industry and government together. It's something the Commerce Committee that could consider doing and bring a panel together, and then you could do it on your own time schedule. You don't need to worry about getting it authorized by law and all that sort of stuff, and we could just advise the committee itself.
And a lot of the issues we have are jurisdictional as well. Whether it's with Intel, whether it's with Armed Services Committee, intersecting with Commerce Committee, and it just, the time it takes is very, very frustrating. But thank you, Senator Lujan, good hearing. Thank you to our panel today for the good information that you have provided to this committee. With that, we are adjourned.